So when I think about what it is we actually do, most of the time we're fixing things, or we're making things, or we're communicating ideas. So yesterday when Dr. Pete was giving his presentation, and nearly everybody in the room put their hands up to say, yes, I'm involved with creating content in some way. Well, that means that you're telling stories. And an okay storyteller can tell a story. A good storyteller can invent a story. Like a journalist goes out and explores a topic and writes down his research and interviews people and eventually comes up with an article with a title that people want to read and engage with and share. A great storyteller knows how to tell a story. Now, our industry is tough, right? Like, sometimes we feel a little bit stressed. We have to work super hard. And we have to work super hard because we have to innovate. We put ourselves under a lot of pressure to compete. And we're competing in two kind of different ways. So we're competing with each other. Some of us work in the same space, right? So this agency has to build more links or whatever than that one to outrank this site, blah. And also we're competing with each other when we pitch against each other as well, right? And that's tough. I always tense up when I hear that some of our favorite friends stroke enemies in the agency space are going to be at the same pitch as us. You know, there's that stuff, and that's cool. But more fundamentally than that, we're competing for attention from our customers. And what we're doing today might not work tomorrow. So we have a challenge. The internet is amazing. It's this magical place. I love it. It pays our bills. We earn our salaries because of the internet. This is a very special place to us. But for us to compete with each other, and actually some of the guys that have been doing this for a little longer than we have, if we're being honest, we've got to learn how the internet works. And I don't think all of us do. Were you one of the 2.9 million people that saw this content in its first 6 days that it was launched? It took them 6 months to collect up all of the assets to be able to produce this piece of work. And it took them 6 months to do the development work, the custom JS, the CSS, the layouts, the 3D rendering, the HTML5 video. There's a lot going on in Snowfall. There were 14 people on the team that were working on this project, 14 people. How many of you in this room have a client that would let you just produce one piece of content over a year with 14 of your team? That's probably millions of dollars worth of content development, storytelling. Pixel Perfect is the story of eBay, a design agency that are credited with the invention of pixel art, and it's really cool, pixel art. I love it. This piece of long form is beautifully illustrated. It's nicely laid out. It's well written. It's hosted on The Verge. Go and check out their long form content section. There's a lot of amazing stuff happening in there. Technically, what I find most exciting, actually, about this piece of work is the way that header image looks like it's zooming in as you scroll. What's actually happening is there's an event handler. It's jQuery. So as you scroll, the size of the image is increased by what we call DOM manipulation. And actually, it's nested inside a Canvas container. I'm going to talk about Canvas in a moment because it's ridiculously powerful. And that bit of code's so elegant that it's also looking at the browser size and deciding in what increments to resize the image as you scroll, which is an incredibly clever way to do it. And I bet hardly anybody noticed. I didn't until I decided to look because I wanted to know how that was built. So we have to be super careful about asking for things that we don't really understand, that could be more than just a trivial piece of development work. This is called Car Faults, and it's a piece of work that we did to help people learn a little more about different types of automobiles, like classic cars. And it's got RTO, really targeted outreach. It's got stakeholder recruitment. We followed the whole content development process all the way to the end. And then when we sent this to the client for it to be launched, It didn't work. They put it on their servers, and the thing just wouldn't work. And the reason why is, I mean, you look at this piece of work and you think, well, it's designed okay, and it looks kind of pretty. I bet most of the time spent on this piece of project work was just chopping it into HTML and getting it shipped. It wasn't. It was these white buttons on your right-hand side. They took 2 days. The reason why they took 2 days is the way this thing was hosted, or was going to be hosted, was on an enterprise web server network with all load balancers and all of this crazy stuff. And what was going on was that the load balancers were executing the JavaScript. They were pre-processing the content, kind of like a headless browser type of a situation, and then they were serving what they saw. And with JavaScript, what you really want is the browser executing your JavaScript, because all of the things that you've built rely on that being possible. And this came as a surprise to us, and we had to spend a night rebuilding it to make those dots work, to make the scroll actions work in a library called MooTools, which is a little bit more hardcore than jQuery. And even getting the cross-browser compatibility right, so it worked in all of the different browsers, became a very non-trivial piece of work to do, which is why it took 2 days. So I think that a really talented storyteller, a gifted storyteller, understands the medium via which they choose to tell a story. And the challenge that we face is that this is competitive. We're giving each other examples of what we think great content looks like, but we might not necessarily understand what it is we're really looking at. And we've got to evolve, because the people that are producing some of the examples that I've just shown you aren't marketing agencies, they're publishers, they're people who are just really interested in making something cool. And that's an interesting challenge. And the whole time, this is where some of our industry still is. So we've got to stop doing that. We've got to stop pooping on the internet. We've got to decide to do something a little bit more special. Otherwise, it doesn't matter how good your content strategy is. We're going to get left behind. I want you to go check out Oliver Emberton. His blog is consistently exceptional. The ideas that he has in his stories are brilliant. The graphics that he chooses and designs are brilliant. And his social engagement is just amazing. 520,000 shares on this one post. Rand put this in front of me, and it's amazing. But the whole site is incredible. And this guy is just doing that because he's interested. He wants to develop something of note. And this is the kind of stuff that we look at and we go, yeah, that's pretty good. And this is the kind of stuff that we're competing with. Now, I think for a long time, I've always been telling myself, God, this stuff's really hard to do. Like, it's really, really hard to do. How am I going to build this kind of thing? Well, look, I'm a marketer, so that makes me a project manager when I'm making these things happen. It's no different, really, to hiring a designer, hiring a copywriter, whatever you need to do. The difficult bit isn't necessarily doing it. It's understanding the vocabulary that you require to be able to describe what it is you want to happen. I mean, web developers understand the technologies that they work in, but then again, do we? And it's pretty disheartening as a web developer when you're dealing with a client or a customer or whatever, and they're looking at you with just a glazed expression. They've got no idea what the pair of you are talking about. One of you's talking about jQuery, the other one's talking about fade-ins and flashing lights. So how this started for us is, it started with me throwing my toys out of the pram, which happens every now and again. Hi, team. We share content internally at Built Visible with this little tag in the subject line. It's a nice little tip, actually. If you find cool stuff, share it with the whole company, tag it up in the subject line, and then you can go back to Gmail to find it later for blog posts and things. And at first, we'd share stuff with each other, and you can imagine receiving an email with a link for you to click. And in the email, it said, this stuff's really cool. Well, this is great. Wow, look at this. Look at all the likes. Boom. And I realized that's absolutely not good enough for us. I mean, we're supposed to be cutting-edge content marketers. We're supposed to be in a place where it's us producing this work all the time. And yet here we are, we're just saying this is cool. And so the challenge that I put in front of my company is, we've got to know how it's built. You've just got to know that. And that doesn't mean you've got to be able to do it. It just means that you've got to know what it is that you're looking at. Because if we don't know that, then how on earth can we tell the story that we'd envisaged in our minds? We're not giving our content strategy, we're not doing it any justice. So let me show you some stuff. SVG, who's worked with scalable vector graphics before? Awesome. SVG, scalable vector graphics, are awesome because it's an image rendering protocol, basically, where you get the browser to render the image instead of serving an image from your server. So you can do really, really cool stuff like this. This is Polygon's Xbox One review. And it's a piece of long-form content, and each of the individual items are nested in the article. So lots of traces of things like, the Xbox and the controller pad and all that type of stuff. Really engaging, like you just want to sit and stare at the work. You forget to read the article because the visuals are so clever. What's actually going on here is that there's an SVG in the web page. It's been embedded. And then they're using a little bit of jQuery to do what's called a path animation. And what's actually happening is that there's a path attribute in the XML that describes the SVG. And in that path attribute, there's a bunch of numbers. The jQuery is just manipulating what those numbers say. That's called DOM manipulation. And if you sat down with a developer and said, here's an SVG, or here's a file, and I want you to talk to me about what you can do with this with a little bit of path animation, I think you'd really make their day, probably. So what is jQuery? Well, to me, it's a library of functions that have been built in JavaScript. jQuery it's based in JavaScript, but somebody else has already sat down and done all the hard work, all of the things that we need in our browsers, clever fades, scrolls, all of that type of stuff that we potentially just gloss over on the internet when we're sharing this great content. jQuery is behind most of it. If it's not jQuery, it's usually either some custom JavaScript or maybe MooTools, but jQuery is the good one. And this is the kind of stuff that jQuery can do, like nice and simple. This is an interactive infographic from Intuit, and it's based in HTML. It's got embedded videos and all that kind of thing. The story is about the future of the office. It's based on a video from the BBC programme Tomorrow's World, and it's really cute. Like, they've got filing cabinets going around with wheels and a little aerial on them, a little bit like a really early version of Roger, maybe. And you can see as you scroll, look at the bar charts moving. And that's a really simple bit of manipulation with jQuery. What's actually happening is the pixel width in the div that describes each one of those individual bars is just being increased as you scroll. And that's it. WebGL is really exciting. It's a 3D rendering language for a browser. It works in Chrome. And with WebGL, you can do stuff like this. This is ChemDoodle. And ChemDoodle is actually a piece of software that helps chemists map molecules for different kinds of drugs. But they have sort of an online version where you can evaluate their files by uploading it to ChemDoodle, and then it makes these snazzy little 3D animations. And that 3D is based in WebGL, and it's a technology that runs on your 3D hardware in your computer. So it's kind of still unreliable on other browsers. It doesn't work on IE, for example, but it does work beautifully in Chrome. And if you want to see WebGL absolutely killing it, then you need to go to Chrome Experiments and have a look at what it can do. And think about that for a moment. So this is an entire, it's a solution to tell a story that we're really not thinking about using at scale. And you think about what you could put your customer in some kind of a 3D immersive environment. You can communicate with them in a different way to just a web page or just a blog post or just an article. And that's why I find this stuff super exciting. And we see CSS all the time, right? Because we're doing technical work, we're checking for minus 999 pixels to the left, all of those kinds of things. But actually, CSS is a really, really powerful presentation layer language. And you can do stuff like this with it. This is a CSS animation. There's no JavaScript. It's just running in the browser. And it's by Anna Tudor. who is a remarkable talent. She's the baby dino on Twitter. This is just maths. It's CSS with trigonometry and obviously lots of rotates and things like that and zooms, but it's all happening in the browser and it's all happening in CSS. And you look at this and you think, wow, this is a real surprise, but actually it's been around for quite a while. This is actually not a terribly new example, but still, we don't use this stuff very much. Phil Nottingham from Distilled was talking about how to make great videos yesterday, and I really enjoyed that presentation because I've been thinking about HTML5 video in a slightly different way, because we have creatives that can produce the content for us, but I think that there's an extra step that we can take, which is that the context in which we brief the people that make the video for us, if we explain to them how we might be presenting that HTML5 video in the browser, they could produce something different. I've got a list of tasks for you to do when you all get home, and I'll share those with you in a minute, but check this guy out. His name's Wes Boss, which is an interesting surname. He's a cool guy, though, super talented. This presentation here, he gave at an O'Reilly conference, at Fluent, sorry. He talked about what you can do with HTML5 video in the browser in Canvas, and you can tile video, and you can recolor it, and you can spin it round, and you can chop it up into bits, so you can make like a 24-style status alert, segue, whatever you call those things. You can even turn on somebody's webcam with a single line of JavaScript, and you can put glasses on their face, because Canvas has an arbitrary facial recognition API built in. And you can do all of that with such a tiny amount of code, and that's what that video teaches you to do. And I think about that for a second. We are sending out content, and we're producing tons of this stuff, but we can put our customers in our content. We can get them to interact with things because they can see themselves in our brand message. And that just hasn't been explored at all. And there are loads and loads and loads of just JavaScript libraries that you can use super quickly, super easily. I love high charts. Right, we've seen loads of high charts actually this conference. It was in Marshall's software. It's in Moz Analytics, I believe. And once you get the hang of how to generate a chart in high charts, you can produce content that just looks a little bit nicer. So no more screenshots of Excel charts, right? Because everybody's seen those before. These are a little bit interactive. They give you the data. You can play around with them in the mouse. You can zoom in. You can download as a PNG or as an SVG. Which is what those charts are, actually. That's what high charts does. It's just an SVG manipulation library, and through a bit of JSON, which is the data it uses, the data format it uses to be able to draw, it produces an SVG for you, which is really cool. You could combine that with some jQuery and do some insane things with charts. And these are things that I've never seen before, but I know that's possible because I understand roughly what those two technologies can do with each other. So think about that. And think about that conversation with the web developer again, right? Instead of the glazed expression as the web developer starts asking you about browsers and how it will be served and whether or not it's okay to do something with SVG, learn that vocabulary list. And I'm sorry about the bullet points, but there's no other way to do this. That is your vocabulary. This is the standard language set, the standard lexicon that you need to be able to do what it is I think we're all going to be doing in the next year. And in the back of this presentation, there's 3 slides with a list of videos that I've collected up. And if you watched every single one of them, then after about a day, you could probably blag your way through a conversation with a web developer about what they're doing, which we've got to have. So that's the what. This is the stuff that I think we all need to understand a little bit better. But all of this started to make sense to me a little bit more when I came across the New York Times Innovation Report. It was leaked. A lot of soul searching for those guys internally about where they were headed, what they were doing, how their performance was working out. And there's one quote in particular that stood out to me. I'd rather have a snowfall builder than a snowfall. Let's not forget that the New York Times took a year to produce that piece of work, and we don't have a year. I think usually most of us have about 2 months at best to get something shipped and on with the next thing. So that idea really resonated with me, and it's what triggered this phase of our evolution as an agency. I became really interested in the how. Like, some of this is about being able to have a conversation with a web developer and actually being able to produce something that's great. Some of it's about being able to run a project that works, that isn't stressful, that comes in on budget and on time and on scope. And I was very lucky because, yeah, my team, who are super busy, they let me use their time for us to all reflect together on precisely how this kind of thing should be done. We've been doing it already, but we've been doing it for clients. And when you're doing client work, actually, you get less time to learn and develop yourselves. So this was fun, and this is part of what we came up with. And I'm going to explain to you what this is in a little while, but this is the thing that we built. It's part of an article that we wrote on the topology of the physical internet, how undersea cables are there, and they're transmitting all of our data, and the NSA is tapping into them, but you guys don't know they're there. And it's a super interesting story. And this little bit here, I'll explain how it's built in a moment, but it's been around for a few days, and we've had a lot of success with it because the Washington Post wrote about it, which I liked. Thank you, guys. So there's my team over there. Where are they? They're all hiding. Hi, team. And Liam's here today, and I promised my team that I'd embarrass him by calling him out, but I'm calling him out for the good work and the leadership that he exerted on us all to make this thing happen. So I want to talk to you about the how, right? What is the process that we used, broadly? What stuff do you need to know to create a project like this, to get it to work? And for me, I became a client of our agency for a little while, and so the first interaction that I had with my agency was I was invited to a creative presentation meeting. And that was the output of a creative planning session. So I was presented with a whole bunch of different ideas, right? Now these are ideas that Liam and the team, Sophie, Dan, everybody who was working on this, put together to present back to me the things that they would like to create. In fact, they were just topic ideas at this point, like broadly, we've discovered this subject and we think that it's got some appeal and we'd love your permission to explore it in a little bit more detail. That's fundamentally the purpose of what we often refer to as a creative planning meeting with a client. I'll talk to you about what was happening before that in a moment, but this is important. So first of all, Pete was talking about creativity yesterday, and I think actually learning a methodology to help us be more creative is quite a big challenge for us at the moment, because what I've always found SEOs and content marketers tend to do is you guys come up with what you're usually told that you've got to produce an infographic or 4 or something, in the next 6 months. You've got volumes to meet, you've got to write articles. And then the next thing that happens is you come up with a title for these ideas, right? Because that's what you've got to do. And then you go off and you do the research for that title. And that's it's so tough to come up with an idea for a story that people in that space are going to really enjoy before you've done any real research about the topic as a whole. And what this book teaches you is the most effective method to collect all of your ideas together, like investigate a topic in its fullest, and then let that information, let that research start to inspire you with the things that stand out that people might want to enjoy and read. And check out Liam's post on the same thing. Even though it's titled, "There is no creative method," it's actually about a creative method, so kind of misleading. But anyway, so there I am in this meeting, and by genuine coincidence, one of the ideas that the guys presented to me happened to be the main theme of a book that I was reading at the time. And the book's called Tubes, and it's by a guy called Andrew Blum. Now, we all live on the internet, right? And so we need to understand how the internet works. This book will teach you that in a couple of hours. It's actually a really interesting read. It could be labeled as boring, but I don't think there's any such thing as boring. I think there's useful and there's crap and there's very little in between. Read this book, because what Andrew does, it's not just about the story of how the internet works, it's also the fact that he's taken an idea that you might label as boring, and he's made it really interesting. Like, I got so excited about the internet after I'd read this, it was, yeah. So anyway, we're in the meeting, and Liam and the guys present this idea to me, and my face lit up, but so did theirs. In the time that they'd been researching this topic, they got really interested in it. And this is, I think, probably one of the most important things that we need to accept about ourselves, that we have unique interests, we have unique experiences, and we bring those with us when we're working on projects like this. And as a client or as an in-house manager, whatever position you're in, when you see the people around you who are going to build something for you, get excited about one of those things. Choose that. Think about the people that they are and the unique skills that they bring. Sophie, who was in the meeting, she builds maps and things like that with fusion tables by embedding Google Maps in her blogs. And that's really impressive. And we sort of knew in this meeting that it would probably head in the direction of a piece of long form, and given the topic, there'll be a map. So we're going to need a map. Let's choose somebody who's interested in doing that. So at this stage, they've run this meeting with me, and I've kind of decided on a topic. We think that we've got a story. We kind of have that, but not how to tell it. We are not saying we've got to produce an interactive or we've got to produce an infographic. What can we talk about? Because I think that's kind of the wrong way around. You need to absorb a topic first and then decide the medium via which you're going to communicate that thing. I think that makes a lot of sense. So there's a bunch of stuff that was going on before this meeting. I've deliberately skipped ahead, so let's skip back. One of the biggest lessons that we've learned as an agency while we're producing this type of work, technical setup and feasibility. Rolls off the tongue. But remember that example that I gave you of the iconic cars thing at the beginning, and there was a key detail about the way that would be hosted, which really screwed us up. Like we had to rebuild it overnight. Had we have done this, we would have known that that was going to be an issue. So technical setup is, well, that's talking with the development team and asking them how the content you're going to be providing to them is going to be hosted. And if the development team don't know, speak to the network people, right? And we'd learned that there was this caching, this load balancing that was executing the JavaScript, which broke that project. But we learned, and now we have a checklist of things that we ask when we meet up with the server team to make sure we can serve it. That was lesson number one. Lesson number two is that if you're planning to sort of head in a particular direction with a particular type of story, before you present it to the people that decide whether or not that's a good idea, you really should get together with the people that you're going to ask to build it. And the reason why is that, and I'll explain this in a moment, is that as you create designs, you get excited about your wireframes, what you're doing is you're scoping functionality. But if you're doing the design work first before you've spoken to a developer, what you're doing is you're scoping entirely unique functionality that might need a total custom development solution to be able to build. And so with a few small changes, you might have just added 6 months of bandwidth to a development project, and you just don't know about it yet. So we sit down with the developers and we say, listen, we think we're going to present this idea to our client. What do you think to this? And the cool thing that developers will do if you give them lots of advance notice is they'll say, well, if you're going to build a map, then you're going to need maybe a slider, and that's a little bit of custom JS, but we can pull the data from the Google Maps API, and as long as you're storing it in JSON, we can call for it with this, and we can change that scroll action with some jQuery. They get excited and they feel part of it, but also you very, very quickly start to understand how your project's going to work, and that's very exciting, and more on that in a minute because we take that a little bit further. So that is why we do technical setup and feasibility. Do it first. So last year I was talking about really targeted outreach, and I talked about how we involve stakeholders right at the beginning of a project, and that's because I don't believe that marketers are the right people to be producing expert-level content. We need to assist experts to produce expert-level content. And so we start with an idea, and then we find out who it is that has some influence in a space. We call that stakeholder outreach, and we do it really early on. We do it before we've done much research. We certainly do it before we've put pen to paper. We're not writing anything yet. We're certainly not designing anything. We find people who'd be willing to contribute. And we find experts, we find publishers that are sold on the idea of publishing this work for us. Super exciting stuff, because when you get a positive response back, A, they're going to give you some feedback on the story, and that's going to help you shape what it is that you're going to do. But also, you can go into a content project with a sense of hope that it's going to be a success. That's your motivator. You've got Wired or The Verge who are interested, and you're going to work super hard to make sure that you've built something for them, something that they want to run with, because that's how we seed our content. We don't do any paid promotion at Built Visible. It's all earned, and we make it earned because of the stakeholder recruitment process right at the beginning, and we involve them all the way through. So the next stage is we've got our stakeholders. The client is kind of happy about the idea. We know that it's possible. So the next thing we need to do is start the asset collection and the research. So I said, let's study a topic. Let's really soak it up before we decide on the title, before we decide on the exact story. That is this process. And we use a tool at Built Visible called Murally. And what Murally does. It's a canvas on which we can store ideas, snippets of text, images, and as you're working around the canvas, you can begin to position things so they have some relevance to each other. You can start thinking about the flow of your storyboard, which I'll talk about in a moment. So I love Murally, and I was blown away by this when the guys showed me it. And so we start to collect our assets and our snippets of research for that. This isn't authorship, this isn't writing, this is just, here are the raw materials for this piece of work. Here it is in action on Liam's desk. Sorry, buddy. I had to blur your Post-it note. Anyway, the way Liam's using this piece of Murally, this piece of software, is using it with dual screens. So he's dragging images from one screen to the next as he's traversing that part of the internet, as he's doing his research. So you can build research so quickly just by doing this. Copying bits of text, pasting, dragging images across, linking them together, positioning them together into subtopics. That's the way to do it. And by the way, on that screen, that is a piece of interactive content to help people with property owners, liability insurance in commercial property. Super boring content, but I think it's going to do really well because it's the only insurance company that are doing it right. Anyway, so now we've got all of our pieces in play. We've got our assets, we've got our images, we've got all of that stuff. We need to really start thinking about storyboard creation. Now, you guys are going to be really disappointed when you see one of our storyboards because they're a bit dull, but they do their job. And that's what they're there to do. It's an iterative document that helps us structure certain aspects of the story we're going to tell. It is not visual. I'll show you. In a storyboard, we have three key characteristics: data, flow, and assets. And this is how they all work together. So our data are our raw materials. They're snippets of text, links to images, you know, whatever those things are, the things that you'll probably use to brief a journalist or a copywriter. Then you start working on flow, and a storyboard's an iterative thing. You start to sort of position where you think each one of these pieces of information might exist, and therefore you start to think about how it's organized, how it might flow. And it starts off as a random jumble of ideas and begins to become something that you could build in chronological order. And then finally, the assets that you're collecting, so copy and images, because, you know, by this point in the story, we've probably already decided that this is going to be a long-form, interactive piece of content. It's going to have images, obviously, it's going to have text, it's going to have some authorship, and we're going to need some features. And features are the things that we've briefed the developers on by this point, too. Some of these processes work together, features being a map or something, and I'll explain that in a moment. So all of that connects together and becomes your experience. But we still haven't thought about the design. And it still isn't the right time for us to start thinking about the design. It's too early. So this is our storyboard. I told you you'd be disappointed with it. It's a Word document. And it stays a Word document throughout its whole life. And this is what goes to a developer, by the way. And the reason why we don't use any visuals is that a storyboard needs to brief on the structure of the content, right? And I'll explain why I think that's important in a moment. So in one of the earlier iterations of the storyboard, I think you can get so far when it's okay to brief the developers to start work, because there are some components of something like an interactive that actually need some thought and they need to be developed first. You know, it's okay to start these things in chunks. And we use a version of rapid prototyping, which is an idea that's been around in web development for quite a long time. It's nothing new, but I think it's something that's quite new to content marketing. So when we sat down with the development team early on, we sort of talked to them roughly about what we'd need. But the stage when the developers actually start doing the work, we have to have a very, very clear idea of the medium via which we're going to tell a story. Is it video, or is it a presentation, a microsite, is it an article, whatever? And the features that we're going to find in that piece of work as well. So, you know, an embedded chart, video embed, SVG animation, etc. And if you've got the data for them to be able to make a start on those components of the work, then that is the right time to get them to actually make a start. Because to make these projects work super well, what we've got to do is just speed it up and make it, you know, kind of like more efficient. And we need to use the maximum amount of notice time for these guys to do their best job as we possibly can. So that's why we start them early. But remember, this stuff, you know, this is your content, right? So we're developing the storyboard, we're collecting our assets, we've made a start on the authorship, we know roughly the type of structure that we're going to use for the presentation. So on that note, we put the content in a browser, we structure it, and then we start developing the ideas around that. So we're developing in the browser, and that's because the work that we produce is for the web. It isn't for Photoshop. So why would we start with Photoshop? Let's prototype it, let's get the functionality right, and then let's brief that into a designer. So this is, whoops, yeah, we can use this one. I've skipped one. This is the first version of the prototype that the dev team built. The storyboard, its flow, the content assets that we'd given them were enough for them to be able to build a first early version. And obviously most of the work, I mean, look at the design. The design's rough. It's pretty bad. But most of the work was already happening in this. This map started life on its own in just a browser, and they developed that first. I'll explain how it works in a minute. And then they positioned the content all around it, and they were using, our responsive style sheet for that. So you imagine giving this to a designer and say, look, can you style this for us? Versus trying to write a huge PowerPoint presentation with screenshots, and I want it to be a bit like this, and maybe it needs to be arranged like that. Designers design a presentation layer. They're less good at designing web functionality for you, and we've learned that because when we brief PSDs into developers, they have a funny look on their faces, like they hate you. So that's why we do that. So eventually, once we're happy with the prototype, we've iteratively got the content in, we're happy with the way things like the interactive components function, that's when it goes to the designer. And the designer sends this back in a couple of days instead of a couple of months. And it just comes back styled, because that's what designers do. Now, because the developers have already structured the web page, they've used the right markup, it's a relatively trivial matter of them just styling it. So they've got to update their CSS style sheet, put any new class attributes in, et cetera, et cetera. And that's easy. They know what to do when you ask them to do that. So this is what the finished product looked like, because we went through this process and we've learned a lot, but ultimately we wanted to build something that we could put out there just to market ourselves, just to show, yeah, no, we can do this, we're pretty excited about it. And so this is what we ended up with. And this map is, well, Pete Wales calls it witchcraft. He built it. It's based in Google Fusion tables. The data that you see there comes from the organization called Telegeography. They're the guys that map the undersea cables. And they also produced us a KML layer, which means that we can position cables around the map. The slider, that's custom JavaScript. That's just executing. It's just revealing a new node every time the slider moves. The data is stored in Google Fusion tables, and Google Fusion tables can talk to the Google Maps API. And there's an article on this on Built Visible, so you can learn how to do this yourself. The secret source, but it's not really secret. If you have a poke around in the source, you can use the JavaScript. There's some custom JavaScript that animates it. So this was quite a lot of dev work, but actually we're just using systems and products that are there for us already. So anyway, launch is easy, actually. When you've got an interactive with, it's all ready, you've got your stakeholders, you've stayed in touch with them, so the publishers are sort of aware, they've given feedback on the development work, and they're ready to go with it. Launch becomes pretty easy, and obviously you push that out there. I mean, it's a useful tip, actually. What we learned to do was password protect the interactive, so when it went out to the publishers, they felt like there was more of an exclusive sort of feel to the piece of work. But anyway, so that was launch. Our good friend Darren at Built Visible pushed out the emails for us, and we got some coverage. So it went out in the Washington Post, and the traffic was amazing, and we're super happy with it. This is an older slide. It's done even better since. Washington Post covered it, Daily Mail. Gosh, it was really popular in Greece and Finland and the Netherlands, I think because they love undersea cables or something. But anyway, we've got a ton of traffic, and we're really, really happy about it. But the point of this whole thing was what is it that we can learn about ourselves along the way? So we've now got this process, and what I want you all to do is just take that process and develop it for yourselves and see if it makes your project development work any easier. For us, we learned a bunch of stuff. So on bandwidth, if you're building one of these things, think about whether or not you're going to be exceeding the rate limits of any of the data service providers that you're using. Google Fusion tables can only handle 25,000 views, unique requests per day, and I think we used that up quite quickly. And you can see from Pete's comment, apparently, we didn't do the due diligence on bandwidth. We didn't know where our limits were, so that came as a surprise, and we had to put in an arbitrary load balancer just to cache the requests if they were the same as requests that had already been made by other people. Shareable assets, we took a long, long time developing this map, and then somebody came along and made an animated GIF out of it, and that was more successful than our map. And we were like, oh, because we'd also spent a long time trying to develop the map to make it embeddable, and we couldn't do that because it was just too complicated, so we binned that part of the project. The whole time, we could have just produced an animated GIF, and now everybody's linking to the Washington Post like this. This was, I think we had 16,000 sessions come from this one piece of coverage in a couple of hours on Friday. I mean, it was really, really insane. People love this topic. It's quite a boring topic, but people love it. This is good, because I'm quite a boring person. I'm a geek. Anyway, and then you realize, actually, when you're doing an interactive or when you're doing something like a new kind of a project, you forget to remember all of the stuff that you've learned from similar but slightly different projects. So, you know, when you were doing your first infographic and you had to get the title right and make the landing page experience of it really compelling, then you go into interactive mode and you forget all of those rules. And the same applies to the SEO. On page speed, the guys sent out a JPEG that was 4 megabytes, and the load time was just insane. So I compressed that down to 600K and got below a second and a half. And you have to remember to be an SEO when you're evaluating this stuff. The non-JavaScript enabled version has some 404s in it in the nav. Lesson learned. Evaluate your work as an SEO, turn JavaScript off. And brief your designers to respect your main browser sizes. So, you know, iPhone, iPad, desktop. We had a little bit of difficulty with this because somebody forgot to make that clear. Unfortunately, we've got Pete who managed to pick up the mess and clean it all up for us. And then test with Responsinator, because Responsinator will just give you all of the different views that you need to be able to make sure this thing works. If it goes wrong, I think it's either because we've missed a step in the process, one that we knew about but chose to ignore almost every time, or there's something new that we need to update the process with, as in we've learned something, we've got to skip it. And the golden rule, the thing that I learned most clearly from this, because I decided I wasn't quite happy with the first version of the design and I delayed the project for 2 weeks to get that fixed, is if you don't love something, you can't ship it. You've got a team of marketers who are going to be promoting a piece of work. If you give them a crap piece of work to push out there, they're not going to put their hearts into it. Anyway, that's pretty much me. I just want to thank Liam, Danny, Darren, Robin, Pete, and Daniel Butler for their hard work on this project. This wasn't my work. They were the ones that built it, not me. And Jeff, of course, for letting me use his precious little resource in his team to make it happen. So when you give me a round of applause, I'd appreciate it if you could give them a round of applause. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Richard. So that people can see this on the site right now. It's there.
I think we've tweeted it. Yeah, take a look, have a poke around.
Yeah, I
see
saw
our
it. It was
code.
amazing.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
So I just have one question for you. We have to get you on a flight really soon.
Yeah, I know.
So someone like me, who's not as technical, I'm a content marketer. Some of the technical stuff's a little intimidating when I look at it. When you're hiring content marketers at Build Visible, how important is it for you that people come in with strong technical skills, able to do some of this stuff from the get-go?
Not at all.
Not at all.
Yeah, so because of, I think, the way things are in the UK, it's very, very difficult to find people with lots of experience in this, because it's quite cutting edge stuff. Like, I've built you a bunch of resources, like download the presentation and have a look at what it is. I would rather hire a super smart junior, like a fresh graduate, teach them everything they need to do, to learn to be able to do it, teach them SEO. These kids are amazing. And obviously sometimes we're lucky when we find somebody with the right skills, but I would rather start from scratch with these guys. Training and development is good, and promote internally always. It's our thing.
Invest in training your employees.
Absolutely, yeah.
Richard Baxter, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.